Hey DDI, I'm Sean Kennedy, and this lecture is the Political Economy of Prisons and Policing lecture. Um, so in this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the structural relationships that make up the prison system and police departments and their connection to each other. And just as with From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, I want to have a couple of notes at the beginning. So first, what I'm hoping you'll take out of this lecture is kind of a deeper sense of how the various systems of incentives work between things like police labor unions, military contractors, service providers in prisons, state budgets, etc. Um, Second, I'm hoping that this lecture, as with From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, can help you build some crucial context, introduce you to some key concepts that you can use in research going forward, help you to generate examples or new lines of argument as you're debating things like the capitalism critique or even the politics DA, and trying to understand some of the basic underlying structural factors that shape the way that prisons and policing look and why they have some of the effects that they do. Now, again, as with From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, this lecture is going to leave plenty of things out. And again, the purpose here is to serve as sort of a baseline for you to get a sense of some of the key issues and concepts that underlie the political economy of prisons and policing, and to really introduce you, because some of you all may not be familiar with the concept, to the concept of political economy, how that works and how it plays out. This elective is not going to be, or this lecture, sorry, is not going to be completely exhaustive, and that's okay. The purpose of it is to serve as sort of a springboard for future Q&A, research, questions, etc., and to sort of give you a helpful baseline to generate new sets of arguments. So first, let's talk a little bit about what political economy is. Political economy is the way that, prior to economics becoming understood as an econometric science, as it has been more recently, and as even especially since the 1990s and 2000s, as a primarily empirical and data-driven activity, there's an older concept going all the way back to the 1700s and even really further back to the 14 or 1500s of the idea of political economies. And a political economy is essentially an entire system or regime of rules in which various activities are undertaken by the players in that regime. I had a professor for a grad class I took on the history of economic thought, who called it a regime game. So it's basically a game in which relations of power between the various players in the game determines who gets to make the rules and how the rules are enforced, and in turn shapes the activity of the various participants in the game. So when I say it's a game, or when my professor said it was a game, that doesn't mean that it's like something fun to play, like a board game that you play with your friends. It means it's a rule-governed activity in which relations of power shape the formation of rules and shape the activity of the various participants. So a political economy encompasses the behavior of each of the particular individuals within a society, but it also involves institutional structures. Those can include things like corporations. They can include things that are sort of quasi-governmental institutions. Sometimes those things are nonprofits. Sometimes they involve institutions like the Government Accountability Office or the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then sometimes they're explicitly governmental institutions like prisons or public schools. So what we're dealing with here is a system that involves both the law as it's on the books, that involves habits and norms, that involves the accumulation and use of wealth and resources. So it involves all sorts of different relationships of power. And it involves, like I said before, institutions, individuals, nation states, corporations, discursive habits and norms, images within a society, media and their role, the role of media in bringing society's collective attention to particular issues or ideas. So it's a political economy is a very complex system, a very complex regime game. Now, as a result, because of the enormous complexity of any particular political economy, and the US is in some ways a uniquely complex political economy, discussing and developing a sort of model of what that political economy looks like for the purposes of this lecture and for the purposes of the debates that you're going to be having across the season is going to have to simplify what that system looks like. So as I'm discussing some of these issues, I'm going to be simplifying them. And I do want to note, as I said in the From Slavery to Mass Incarceration lecture, while I am an academic who does a lot of research on some of these topics, I'm not an expert in prisons or policing, just like I'm not a historian or an expert on the historical transformation from slavery to mass incarceration or on the US racial caste system. Unlike with the lecture on From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, however, political economy and issues related to the cultural study of political economy are closer to being my area of academic research. So I feel a little bit more comfortable with some of the ideas that we're going to talk about here. And that's why some of the things I'm talking about are a little bit more, are not going to be quite as closely tied to particular sources as they were in the From Slavery to Mass Incarceration lecture. However, I do want to give you a sense of some of the sources I'm using. So like with the previous lecture, I am using Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Bernard Harcourt's book, The Illusion of the Free Market shapes a pretty significant amount of this lecture. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag about the California prison system, and the New York Times Magazine's 2019 profile of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Both are shaping some of this lecture. David Theo Gilmore's book, The Threat of Race. Luc Raquant's From Slavery to Mass Incarceration article that I used for the previous lecture as well. And Alex Vitale's The End of Policing have all kind of shaped this lecture to varying degrees. And then there's a number of other kind of deeper background sources for some of the concepts underlying neoliberal ideology and free market ideology that have also played a role in this lecture. So if you're looking for more kind of evidence or other places to go, some of those sources might be useful places to go to get some additional reading, to dig a little bit deeper. So there's kind of four big sort of topic areas that we're going to talk about. First is the role of neoliberalism and free market ideology as a social imaginary in shaping the basic understanding that many citizens in the United States have of the relationship between individual citizens or individuals within civil society and their relationship to the state, particularly the relationship between taxpayers and government budgets. So the second topic we're going to talk about is prisons and policing within the neoliberal and free market social imaginary as institutions uniquely capable of generating authority and legitimacy as places for government funding, as places for taxpayers to give the government, according to neoliberal ideology, the tax revenues necessary to spend money, places where government spending is legitimate. And that's tied to neoliberalism hollowing out state service provision more generally, except in areas related to security. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper on why prisons and policing are institutions that seem to be uniquely capable of justifying government spending in a way that some other government institutions and government spending are not able to do. Third, we're going to talk about disposable populations, deindustrialization and globalization as justifications for policing and justifications for managing the urban poor and urban environments. And then fourth, we're going to talk about the role of rent seeking in the political economy of policing. And this includes a little bit of chat about private prisons, although not much, and you'll see why when we get there. But more specifically, private services attached to prisons and policing, military industrial equipment producers and suppliers, transfers of equipment to police departments, the role of police unions, etc. So we're going to talk about the role that rent seeking plays in shaping some of the incentives and institutional networks underlying prisons and policing. Okay, so first, free market ideology and neoliberalism. Essentially, free market discourse says that the basic units of society are the state and civil society, which is made up of individuals and individual citizens. So the state's authority and legitimacy as an institution capable of exercising power comes from a contract, an imagined contract with civil society, that the state will secure the liberty of individuals by ensuring laws are enforced, those citizens' livelihood is protected, and the contracts that citizens make with one another are secured. So in essence, the role of the state is to keep individual citizens from harming one another and to ensure that their property is protected and the contracts that they make with one another to transfer that property, basically economic agreements they make with one another, are enforced. Those rules go into effect. There are some more complex dynamics underlying that, but that's the basic structure that free market discourse uses. And in essence, this free market discourse imagines government spending and the power of government spending and government budgets coming from tax revenue. So the government passes laws that tax citizens, and on the basis of that tax revenue, the government is able to spend money because it accumulates tax revenue from citizens. And that means that ultimately, from the perspective of free market ideology, ordinary citizens are funding any particular set of government expenditures. So when the government spends money on the school system, for example, taxpayers are funding a government service that they expect to receive some benefit from. In essence, they are paying for a service that they expect to receive at some future date or on a day-to-day basis. So given that there's this contract between the state and civil society, given that the authority of the government comes from a social contract with individuals, and given that the taxpayers are the ones providing the government with its spending power, as a result, the corollary within free market ideology is that government taxation can only be justified to the extent that it is contributing to the provision of public goods, the protection of livelihood, or the security of contracts. So within this discourse, there's sometimes there's a whole libertarian political philosophy that backs up free market discourse and free market ideology, and that often carries the idea of the night watchman state. That's the language that's used by libertarian political philosophers, including people, for example, like Peter Nozick, who's one of the sort of most influential theorists. He's perhaps more extreme than some of the mainstream public uses of free market ideology, but he's often cited as a source by many of the sort of conservative and even in some cases, quote unquote, nonpartisan figures who espouse free market ideology and discourse. And essentially what Nozick says is that there are certain forms of government power, certain justifications for collecting tax revenue that are obviously legitimate. The military and police, for example, and judges and district attorneys and prosecutors are obviously legitimate agents of the state and legitimate places for the government to spend money, because what they do is they protect ordinary citizens, ensure that their property can't be stolen by other people, and ensure that citizens have to respect the contracts that they've made. And that means that economic activity, the liberty of the individual, decision-making can proceed in a meaningful way, can proceed with the expectation that when an individual enters a contract with another individual where they have a voluntary transaction of economic goods, or of one person agrees to give labor in return for a wage, that those contracts are respected and they don't break down. And even people like Nozick would argue that while in many cases government power is illegitimate, in the case of providing security, of serving a night watchman function, government taxation and government spending and the exercise of government authority is legitimate because what it's doing is protecting individual liberty and protecting contracts and rights to property. Neoliberalism is somewhat different from free market discourse and ideology, but it overlaps with and intersects with it. So there are some ways, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but I just want you to bear in mind that neoliberalism and free market ideology are not exactly interchangeable, and that there are versions of neoliberalism espoused by some democratic politicians, which are not exactly the same as libertarianism, and which manifest in some different ways from libertarianism. So neoliberalism essentially offers a specific critique of the idea of public goods and of publics. And neoliberal philosophy imagines that each individual within a society has an idiosyncratic, a specific and unique view of the world in their own head and their own unique set of preferences. So when, for example, somebody says, a particular politician says justice, says the word justice, people have different ideas in their head about what the word justice means. That word has different meanings for different members of the public. So if we imagine public goods being based upon the moral value of justice, then there are different values that activates for different people in the public. For some people, justice means procedural equality. Each person should be treated in a completely neutral way and should have to abide by a set of laws and procedures that are applied in each case equally to each individual. So everybody is treated equally before the law. Some people call that procedural equality. Another different form of equality is, justice, another different meaning of the term justice, can mean that, that regardless of what the law says, that sort of a higher sense of the right, a higher order of the right thing is done. So that can mean, for example, that if one person is acting like a jerk, regardless of what the law says, it might be right for somebody if they're treating people in the community badly, if they're committing acts of sexual violence or murder. Some people would argue that it's just for that person to be killed, for another member of the society to eliminate that person from society. And that concept of justice, for example, often operates behind ideas like the death penalty, or operates behind ideas like stand your ground. That there is some principle of revenge or retribution, some higher morality of an eye for an eye, regardless of what the law says, that should be recognized by society writ large. That justice involves a sense of reciprocity, that if you do bad things, that bad outcomes will come back to your doorstep. So there's a sense of that sense of reciprocity or higher morality. That's a different meaning of justice. And that's very different than procedural equality. Those are very different concepts of justice. A third concept of justice might mean absolute equality of outcome, that everybody agrees that everybody in society should have the same things. This is, for example, at least in some variants of communism, this is the idea of justice operating behind that political philosophy, that people should have that people should have the same amount of goods and resources, that they should be able to count on exactly the same services being provided to each person, no matter who they are. So it's not about equality before the law, it's about absolute equality of outcome in the way that resources and goods are distributed within a society. So neoliberalism would say that when the word justice is spoken by a politician, different people in society have these extremely different, mutually exclusive or at least very much in tension and contradictory conceptions of justice in their head. That as a result, when we say that there's, when we talk about public goods, we're really speaking about an illusion. And that's because particular words like justice or equality or beauty, those words have different meanings for each different member of society. And so when politicians say that they're going to produce just outcomes, they're speaking about their particular understanding of justice, not an understanding of justice that's held in common by society as a whole. And when that politician wins elections or gains popularity, it's usually not because everybody agrees with their idea of justice. It's because there's slippage in the way that language works, such that the same term can have different meanings for different people. And as a result, people are sort of being diluted, according to neoliberal sort of thinking, the neoliberal social imaginary, into agreeing that they all have the same meaning in mind because they're using the same term. So neoliberals would say that public goods are not actually democratically decided things that everybody agrees on within a society. Instead, public goods are defined by the narrow preferences of political leaders. They're not truly universal. When a public program, for example, decides that it's going to fund arts or it's going to ensure that communities have aesthetic beauty, they're deciding what beauty and what art look like based upon the preferences and definitions of the people who are deciding where money goes within that program, who are allocating money to that program, who are tailoring the program. And that's not necessarily what members of the community think art means or members of the community think beauty means. It's what politicians and bureaucrats have in their head as what beauty and art and aesthetic value mean. So for neoliberals, the idea of public goods is something that they're sort of inherently skeptical of. They will concede that there are some forms of public good. For example, the importance, for the purposes of our discussion, of security, of having a police force that can protect people against violence. That many of them will concede that bridges and roads, common infrastructure like bridges and roads, are public goods, but they want to narrow the definition of public goods very much. And they want to say that to the extent that there appear to be public goods that the government can fund in all sorts of different areas, it's because politicians and government bureaucrats are taking license with how they're using language to distort the actual views of individual members of society. Instead, neoliberals argue, privatizing services, so creating a situation in which the government generates a competitive private market to provide goods like airplane trips or the airline industry, to provide goods like telecommunications infrastructure and the internet, to provide things like even education in some circumstances. Production of shoes, food, light bulbs, utilities and electricity. So neoliberals would argue that privatizing and creating competitive markets for those services, for the provision of those services, is good because it limits the extent to which the government is taxing individuals and using their money to decide for them what is the best set of services, what is the best distribution of their individual income. So neoliberals are saying that the idea of public good is a mistake because individuals have, for each particular individual, their own sense of preferences about where they'd like to spend money. Some people would like to spend lots and lots of their own money on education to get a lot of higher education degrees, or would like to have a lot of beautiful art in their community, or would like to have really, really, really fast internet. And those individuals should choose to spend their own individual money, their own wages on investing in art in their community and in paying a local artist to put a mural on the street. They should spend their own money on tuition to get higher education. They should spend their own money on internet infrastructure and on their Wi-Fi to ensure that they get a really fast Wi-Fi if that's what they want. Because if you don't do that, neoliberals argue, then what ends up happening is that the narrow preferences of political leaders and political elites end up substituting for individual preferences. And people end up in a situation where they're being taxed and money is being taken out of their pocket for services and quote unquote public goods that they don't really want. So the best way to ensure that, that individual preferences are satisfied, that people get what they want, is to create a competitive market system in which companies compete with one another to offer the best goods in a market, in which the government ensures that that competitive market exists, that there are rules, that those rules are followed, and to allow individuals to decide for themselves whether or not they want to spend money on the services that are offered in those markets, and to decide for themselves what criteria they value in deciding between internet service providers or in deciding between the school that they're going to choose for college or whatever. So in essence, the combination of free market discourse and neoliberalism suggests that there is a really narrow role to be played by the state, and that there are only a narrow set of conditions in which government spending can be justified. And it also argues that the way in which a public, when it's making electoral decisions, for example, should think about the pitch being made by the various politicians in that election is as a taxpayer, that the voters should take on essentially the view of the taxpayer as a stakeholder who is going to end up giving money out of their pockets to the government to fund whatever the priorities of that particular politician are. So various citizens should think of themselves as taxpayers, and when they're making decisions in an election, those politicians are making demands upon taxpayers to take money out of their pockets, to spend it in particular areas that those elected officials believe are valuable. So that's essentially the philosophy behind free market ideology and neoliberalism. And you can already start to see behind this ideology that while there are many areas in which government spending is pared back according to this ideology, which it should be pared back, like in education, like in utilities provision, in some areas of infrastructure, like in environmental regulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, like in healthcare. While there are many areas where government spending should be pared back, prisons, policing, the military, achieving security for individual citizens, those are not the areas. Those areas of government spending can be justified using free market ideology and the sort of neoliberal social imaginary of each individual as a sort of stakeholder making decisions for themselves to maximize their own preferences. So prisons, policing, and the military within this ideology have a sort of privileged place as particular areas of government spending that are justified and allowed as means of securing rights to property and in securing individual liberty. A key element in this discourse is the ideology of choice. So neoliberalism particularly purports to be a social imaginary in which each individual is made responsible for the choices that they make, receiving either punishment or reward according to whether that particular choice was economically wise. So in this sense, poverty is the byproduct of not working hard enough or not being smart enough, rather than the byproduct of the structural arrangement of the economy. It's not that you never got the proper opportunity. It's not that the government failed you by failing to correct market externalities or market failures. It's not that that there was a distortion of the economy by monopolies or by rent seeking on the part of corporations. Instead, it's that you are responsible for your lot in life because of the particular choices you make. And if you chose to satisfy your short-term preferences, like playing video games or messing around and not doing your homework, then you end up in a position where your long-term preferences, like having a good job and getting a great education, don't get realized. So that's your fault for choosing your short-term preferences over your long-term preferences, for not being disciplined enough. That's how the ideology of neoliberalism and the free market rationalizes poverty and structural inequality. And within this discourse, labor unions are particularly problematic. So neoliberalism and free market ideology view labor unions as problematic for a variety of different reasons. First, labor unions, they argue, tend to breed corruption by enabling union leaders to wield their membership as a cudgel to enrich themselves at the expense of their members. So these union leaders are able to accumulate personal power and status and political authority. And in the process, they can cut deals that end up being beneficial for the union leader, capitalizing on a lack of transparency where the union membership oftentimes doesn't know what's going on. So there's often this accusation that labor unions create a political machine in which the membership is exploited by sort of corrupt upper crust of union leadership. Second, labor unions, according to neoliberals and the free market ideology, protect particular classes of workers that are most easily able to organize at the expense of other classes of workers who have a much more difficult time organizing. And in the process, what happens is not that labor and workers get a greater share of the productive fruits of an enterprise, a greater share of the profits. Instead, what happens is that one group of workers or one special minority of workers gets advantages to the exclusion of other workers. So workers are pitted against each other. Thirdly, labor unions, according to neoliberalism, are problematic because they encourage workplace regulations that are inefficient and that hurt the both macroeconomic growth within a country, a nation state, even the global economy as a whole, and the growth of the particular firm in which the labor union operates. So, you know, the particular auto manufacturer or computer company or whatever. So that particular company has less growth over time because workers want particular specialized workplace regulations that make the overall firm less efficient and a less productive enterprise. And that means over the long term, the firm fails or there's less money to be given to particular workers. And instead of a rising tide floating on all boats as the economy grows, all boats sink as the waters of the economy go down. Finally, fourth, labor unions, according to this ideology, are problematic because they limit the gains received by the best workers while protecting the worst workers from accountability. So, for example, this is a critique often leveraged by neoliberalism against teachers' unions, that really effective dynamic teachers are paid less than they should be in order to protect lazy teachers who don't do a good job. So neoliberalism and the free market ideology really put labor unions in their sights as institutional arrangements of workers that are not good for a whole host of these reasons, that they essentially replicate all of the problems with government bureaucrats being able to decide the public good. That what those unions do is they allow a small group of people to distort the preferences of individuals in favor of the preferences of a relatively narrow group, and that ends up hurting the welfare of everybody as a whole, producing what the neoliberals and free market ideologues would call unintended consequences as a result. So in general, to summarize, the neoliberalism and free market ideology say that while there are some public goods that require taxation, like schools, roads and bridges, and especially policing, prisons, and the military, and even here there's some disagreement in the case of schools and roads and bridges about the role the private sector should play. In general, free market competition encourages innovation, because it encourages competition between different firms to attract customers or to attract employers, in the case of workers competing to be the most educated, while maximizing individual choice. Conversely, federal government taxation, except in very narrow circumstances, is theft that violates the personhood of individuals and creates market inefficiencies by substituting the preferences of unelected bureaucrats in a narrow political class for the preferences of individuals within society as a whole. The primary role of the state, therefore, should be as a night watchman that ensures property rights are protected and ensures competitive markets exist and that the contracts made within those markets are enforced. However, as Bernard Harcourt notes, free markets are not, in fact, unregulated. And in fact, the exception that the government has an important role to play in providing security and in ensuring the nature of competitive markets creates an ideological avenue for an enormous amount of state power and government spending and for the accumulation of corporate authority and corporate power, as we'll see in a minute. So historically, you might be wondering, okay, this is a lot of like abstract theory and philosophy. How does this fit into the actual like history, what's happening in the US? Well, if you've already watched the From Slavery to Mass Incarceration lectures, then you know that, especially from the late 1960s through to the 1980s, there's a real increase in the extent of unemployment, in the rollback as a result of forces of globalization, automation, increasing competition internationally, as well as the rollback of a variety of regulations and labor protections intended to help workers. So there's some structural things happening with the economy in which there's more unemployment. There's relative to the growing rate of the population, the percentage of the population that's employed in manufacturing industries declines somewhat. There's a lot of workers who lose their jobs, and wages already start to decline to some extent. And there's also a real loss of opportunity, particularly in the urban core, as jobs in places like auto manufacturing and in other manufacturing related industries like toasters and refrigerators, et cetera, start to either go out to the suburbs and out to areas outside of the urban core, where it's very difficult, especially for Black folks, to get housing as a result of housing and mortgage requirements created by the FHA. And additionally, they start to go outside of the US as globalization breeds competition between various countries to secure jobs in those manufacturing sectors. So there's some of the reason why a lot of folks in the urban core start to lose their jobs or don't have access to high-paying jobs anymore is because of globalization and features of globalization. And some of the reason why those jobs no longer exist is that they simply shift to areas outside of the urban core, where it's very difficult for the folks who live in the urban core to get mortgages, to move, to get loans. It's very hard for them to gain access to some of those benefits. I talked about that a little bit in From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, but a lot of the benefits of the post-war economy, things like the GI Bill, things like the Federal Housing Authority's access to cheap loans and low interest rate loans, were not extended to Black workers in the economy and to Black folks in general. And so as a result, a lot of those benefits and protections that help white workers in the post-war economy don't exist for Black workers, many of whom become trapped in the increasingly ghettoized conditions of the urban core, where manufacturing is leaving. And in part, as I mentioned before, that is a byproduct of racial caste. That is a backlash against integration that's happening in urban areas, and a backlash to these sensationalized media images of urban riots and urban unrest, which create a sense for many white folks that the suburbs are a safer place to live. So they abandon ship from what they see as an increasingly dangerous urban core. And as I've explained before, to the extent that crime rates rose, sociologists think that's a result of an increasingly young US population with a larger percentage of people 15 to 24, not as a result of some Black pathology, as was said by many of the racist politicians at the time. So as white folks start to leave those urban areas and move to suburban areas, many of the jobs leave with them. And as a result, schools become increasingly segregated. Housing becomes increasingly segregated again, as a result, in part because of racist provisions in the Federal Housing Authority and the GI Bill. So opportunity is really denied in many important structural ways to Black folks. And as a result, unemployment in the urban core goes way up. And it's increasingly difficult for Black folks to find employment in many of the manufacturing related industries where previously good jobs were possible, and labor union protections ensured that those workers were treated relatively well by the management at those companies. That's really exacerbated by the Reagan administration, which oversees the privatization and deregulation of industries like airlines and telecommunications, while initiating a rollback of labor protections, appointing a bunch of judges. This starts with the Nixon administration, but passes through to the Reagan administration, that increasingly give down a series of decisions rolling back the legal protections for labor unions, that they participate in a whole series of organizational campaigns that have backlash against labor unions, using the ideological talking points that I talked about above, say that labor unions are bad for workers and that they end up hurting the economy as a whole, and create this corrupt class of union leaders. And they contribute through their rhetoric, the Reagan administration contributes through their rhetoric to the ideological construction of citizens as taxpayers, whose votes determine the extent to which the government gets to decide how their money is spent. So Reagan really plays an important ideological role in constructing government spending as taking money out of taxpayers' pockets and encouraging citizens to see themselves as taxpayers who should get to decide for themselves whether and how much of their own money the government spends. So that really changes the frame from providing public goods and ensuring that there's a social safety net or a social insurance program that protects everybody, to the view that the government is violating individual personhood by taking money out of the pockets of individual people. And as a result, Reagan oversees a massive rollback of taxation in a number of different areas. And that ideology, that discourse, in turn, creates this inertia towards rollback of taxation in a bunch of different areas that continues into the George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush administrations. In particular, it's important to note that Reagan's war on drugs rhetoric and anti-Black fear-mongering about welfare queens lead to a sense among white Americans that that Black folks in urban areas are exploiting the welfare system to enrich themselves and facilitate drug abuse, violence, and sexual deviancy in the urban core by taking money and using the largesse of rich white folks living in suburban areas and enriching themselves at the expense of taxpayers. So that discourse, to go back to the Moynihan report and from slavery to mass incarceration lecture, really preys upon this pernicious concept of Black pathology, in which evidence that Black people are being oppressed, that they are being deprived and abandoned by the welfare system, by the education system, by the economic system. The evidence that they are being oppressed in all of those different areas is turned by the Reagan administration using a series of different media images, including civil rights protests and the evidence of Black utilization of the welfare system. They use that as evidence that Black people have some kind of underlying pathology. What, again, to go back to from slavery to mass incarceration, Gunnar Myrdal and Ralph Bunche called the principle of culmination in An American Dilemma, their 1944 report on the condition of Black folks in America. So in response, the Reagan administration, using this war on drugs rhetoric, oversees a massive expansion of prisons, police, and military spending, while at the same time rolling back the welfare system, rolling back and deregulating a variety of different industries and rolling back labor protections. So what happens is that the Reagan administration, and this is something that David Theo Goldberg talks about in his book, The Threat of Race, which I think has a lot of really great cards for this topic, talks about as creating this image in the minds of white folks of a Black welfare state, in which the primary role of the welfare state is to help Black folks and not white folks. That there's a transfer of wealth occurring from white to Black. And the Reagan administration uses that rhetoric to create support, using the idea of the free market and the individual to create support for some kinds of state power and corporate power and state mitigation of individual liberty in areas like prisons, policing, and military spending, while at the same time cutting back a whole bunch of other areas of state power. So according to Bernard Harcourt, we should understand neoliberalism and free market discourse as involving sort of a fundamental bait and switch. On the one hand, what this rhetoric encourages us to do is to think of the state as becoming increasingly deregulated, increasingly creating space for individual liberty, while at the same time, the state is actually engaging in an incredible amount of regulatory behavior, engaging in real crackdowns on everyday use of drugs, on sexual politics, on people's just day-to-day movement through urban space. So on the one hand, it claims to be deregulating individual, the state's power over individuals, while at the same time actually massively expanding in the area of punishment and incarceration the power of the state to regulate individuals in their everyday lives, particularly in the case of US neoliberalism, the lives of Black folks in America. Okay, So that's how some of this discourse and ideology works. And the reason I'm kind of belaboring the point and going into such detail about neoliberalism and the social imaginary of prisons and policing is because it really helps to explain why it seems like such a coherent idea to so many Americans to massively increase the amount of state spending and state power, even as this discourse of individualism and free markets becomes so powerful. So there's really this contradiction happening in the particular area of prisons and policing, where on the one hand, individualism, free markets, choice are celebrated, and the state is treated as a dangerous and politically corrupt institution. At the same time, the state is given enhanced power to search, use lethal force, seize assets from everyday citizens. And that contradiction can be explained in part by some of the details of free market ideology and the neoliberal social imaginary. So that's why I'm talking about that, because that contradiction in the way that state power is understood has enormous implications for this particular debate topic and for why prisons, for example, get such favorable treatment by otherwise sort of libertarian-minded politicians and political constituencies. So that, I think, is really going to help to explain some of the contradictions that will show up on the topic. I think it can really be a useful analytic to use when you're going in and doing critique research. It'll help you to understand some of the ways in which the political economic system is internally contradictory. So the result of this kind of neoliberal and free market understanding of the state and government budgets is conditions of neoliberal austerity. There's a rollback of state spending on public goods, and there's a limitation of redistribution of wealth through taxation, combined with massive amounts of unemployment in especially the urban core, produced that becomes self-propelling. So initially, some of those issues with unemployment are brought on by, like I said before, shifting of employment overseas as a result of globalization into suburban areas as a result of the changing geographic nature of the U.S. workforce. In part, again, that's brought on by the racial caste system, as I've talked about already. But over time, as this neoliberal ideology starts to take hold, labor protections get eroded. And like I said before, labor unions are particularly attacked, which in turn decreases the power that Black workers have. Part of the reason I spent so much time belaboring the point in From Slavery to Mass Incarceration about the role that labor unions played in the civil rights movement is because the end to labor unions, their decreasing power, the extent to which various laws are passed and Supreme Court decisions handed down that limit the power of labor unions, all of those factors really decrease the power of Black workers, and they mitigate the ability of those workers to organize and to ensure cross-racial alliances that break down the power of the racial caste system. So the rollback of labor protections exacerbates conditions of globalization and the movement of labor to suburbs that are reinstigate a new system of racial segregation. So what happens is that increasingly there are millions of precarious workers, especially Black workers, but also importantly Latinx workers as well in urban areas. And these workers become surplus labor that needs to be managed to ensure that they don't mobilize politically. And that need to manage those workers is in part the justification, the reason why, the impetus for neoliberal ideology and free market ideology, the impetus for the Southern strategy, conservative fears about the political power of labor unions, about the ability of Black folks to vote and their ability after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, concerns about their mobilization as a political constituency that would ensure over the long term that Democrats hold political power. That meant that there was a need, quote unquote, a politically motivated need, a ethno-racial need on the part of conservative white political constituencies to manage urban populations, to ensure that those workers did not get angry, or did not get idle on the streets, and couldn't become powerful political constituencies. And that's why I go back to, and talked about it before, those media images of protests, urban unrest, quote unquote, the idea of the civil rights protests creating a culture of lawlessness. That rhetoric plays an important role in communicating to the public and convincing white voters that there's a need for urban population management. And Reagan particularly justifies that need using the rhetoric of the war on drugs. So that these urban areas are dangerous, and that requires a massive amount of police presence and urban population management. So these workers, according to Waquant, as well as Ruth Wilson Gilmore, function as surplus labor. They are, because of this changing structural conditions of the political economy, workers who are sort of surplus to requirements, are not necessary in order for firms to be profitable, in order for the US political economy to generate profit that can be captured by wealthy elites. So that system of capital accumulation on the part of wealthy elites becomes viable in part because all of the costs of that system, or the greater share of the cost of that system, of profit, unequal distribution of profits and economic inequality, is pushed off onto Black workers. And that becomes politically viable using the rhetoric of crime, war on drugs, and welfare queens. That rhetoric plays an important role in justifying and legitimizing for white folks the idea that the welfare system is transferring money from white people and giving it to Black people. That creates a political constituency that makes white people think, well, maybe I don't want to support politicians who are going to take money out of my pocket and give it to people who are going to spend it on drugs, to use the basic equation of conservative political rhetoric. So in addition, what happens in the conditions of neoliberal austerity is not just that workers are precarious surplus labor that needs to be managed. Also, the rhetoric of the free market means that state spending, except in areas related to the security of the population, like policing and prisons, needs to be decreased in general. So increasingly, different departments, different administrative constituencies, like the Department of Education, the Department of Energy, these different constituencies are competing for increasingly limited state funding. So as a result, there's this whole discourse of what's called new management that seeks to get these different departments and their administrators to run their departments more like a business, to try to make themselves more efficient, and to institute a whole series of fees or different means of collecting from particular taxpayers to ensure that they don't overrun their budgets, to ensure that they can accumulate more power for themselves. So administrators in these various different government departments and government agencies at the state, city, and local level all feel like they have to compete with one another to secure their budgets and to protect their workforces. And in turn, they feel like they have to protect their workforces because otherwise they're going to get pressure from their workers day to day to be removed, or they're going to face a whole bunch of internal political consequences if they don't deliver. So if the Department of Education and its secretary don't deliver, then there's a whole bunch of consequences as the teachers union, as state and local officials and other education departments get angry and backlash against them. So all of these different departments are competing with one another and are trying to find ways to be as administratively efficient as possible in order to maximize how far their budgets and their revenue can go. So that means there's competition between these various agencies. So under conditions of austerity, there's this real all against all between government, war of all against all between government departments and public sector workers to ensure that they can capture the greatest share of a shrinking pie of government spending. And in that environment in which prisons and policing are uniquely politically legitimate sources for government spending because of rhetoric of war on drugs, because of free market discourse and neoliberal ideology, et cetera, prisons and policing become catch-all solutions for social problems. So late 1960s and early 1970s, prison abolitionists sought to fight poverty, desegregate schools, build new housing, provide mental health care, and combat employment discrimination as ways of fighting crime, as ways of ensuring a more just society in which prisons would no longer be necessary because society, different publics, different areas of the country would have the sense of social bonding and trust necessary to mediate their own problems, to resolve issues without recourse to policing in prisons, to believe in and trust in restorative justice techniques and different mediation techniques to resolve problems peacefully without recourse to state violence. Instead, what ends up happening is that rather than the government providing all of those different sources of support, instead, all of those areas are rolled back, treated as enabling deviant behavior, particularly in Black neighborhoods on the part of conservatives. So all of those areas are rolled back as bad uses of state funding, and instead prisons and policing are said as being the solution to crime. So giving money to desegregate schools and fight poverty is no longer seen as a proper solution. Instead, the solution is punishment and discipline of poor people throughout America, with the idea in mind that when that discipline and punishment is undertaken, those people will eventually be forced, poor folks in America, especially poor Black folks, will eventually be forced to take personal responsibility for their behavior. And that rhetoric is used over and over and over again. The rhetoric of taking personal responsibility for the choices that you make is used over and over again in this particular set of political messages. So prisons are treated as catch-all solutions for all these different social problems. In the process, there are sort of four forms of surplus that are generated according to Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She talks about this explosion of carceral geographies in which these four different surpluses come together, and they cause a massive explosion of the prison population and of police budgets and of even military budgets writ large. So these four forms of surplus are: first, surplus labor, which we've already talked about. And she's talking specifically about California, but this is true in other areas of the US political economy as well. Second, surplus land. So there are many places throughout the US where farmers don't have enough money to irrigate crops, and that's in part because of privatization of water and the rollback of regulations of environmental protections and provision of services. So there's surplus land that farmers want to get rid of. And in order to get rid of that land, what they want to do is lease it out to prisons who will buy it from them at a really good price. Third, there's surplus state capacity. So a bunch of different government agencies have now lost the mandate to use their expertise in funding for social welfare benefits. So they search around and they find other ways to use their mandate instead and their accumulated expertise. And that's also true of nonprofits and think tanks as well, which increasingly employ a lot of their expertise and their staffs to ensure that towards the goal of policing in prisons and to the goal of ensuring that prisons and policing are used more efficiently. So there's surplus state capacity. Finally, there's surplus capital. Essentially, there is a whole class of investors called public finance investors, and they buy bonds from the government for certain big infrastructure projects. This includes education bonds, infrastructure bonds for things like highways. They can include bonds in energy-related areas. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of bonds that they can purchase. In the past, they had purchased bonds for schools and housing, but those bond markets are starting to dry up as fewer new schools are being built, as less new public housing programs are being rolled out, as there's an increasingly small social welfare state. So instead, those public finance investors turn to prison bonds as a place to invest. And they see prison bonds as being a way of shoring up their portfolios, of finding a source of low-risk investments that can give weight and ballast to the higher risk investments they want to make in other sectors like venture capital for technology or whatever else. There are a bunch of different areas, and finance is complicated, but essentially there's surplus capital there as well. So there's surplus labor, the populations excluded from the changing nature of the economy, from which the prison population is drawn and who need to supposedly be managed because otherwise they're going to get out of control. So there's surplus labor, there's surplus land, farmers who don't have enough money to irrigate their crops and whose crops are becoming increasingly no longer economically viable as a result of the increasingly globalized nature of agricultural economy. There's surplus state capacity as governments lose their agency to use expertise and funding for social welfare benefits, and there's surplus capital from public finance investors who no longer have school and housing bonding to invest in and instead turn to prison bonds. So those four surpluses, specifically Ruth Wilson Gilmore is talking about them in California, but throughout the US political economy as a whole, make prisons and policing particularly powerful areas of state power and growing areas of state capacity where money, expertise, political legitimacy, public support, media attention, political rhetoric, et cetera, are being funneled. So there's a whole bunch of power, money, attention, resources, et cetera, being funneled into prisons and policing. Now, an important element that Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I've mentioned her several times, but is a really important academic thinker in the area of carceral geographies and a really important organizer for prison abolition. She makes the important point that prisons, that the analogy between prisons and slavery that I discussed in the previous lecture, from slavery to mass incarceration, does break down in important ways. We talked about this a little bit in the previous lecture, but while in convict leasing, the intention was essentially, and sharecropping, the intention was essentially to re-enslave Black folks in order to exploit their labor in the agrarian economy of the post-Civil War South. In mass incarceration, the goal is not to exploit the labor of prisoners in prisons. Instead, that labor is viewed as surplus to requirements within the US political economy. It's no longer necessary because of globalization. So as a result, those workers are placed in prisons for a whole bunch of structurally complex reasons, in part because, politically speaking, there's fear that they'll get together and organize as laborers and as a political constituency and vote out, become a very powerful voting bloc against conservative politicians. And in part because there's a whole host of stakeholders, farmers, government agencies, public finance investors, prison guards unions, police unions, and various other political constituencies, whole host of stakeholders who are invested in incarcerating those people, who are invested in the idea of an emerging prison and policing economy. But importantly, as she notes, again, while it's true that the labor of people in prisons is sometimes exploited, and there are many corporations who underpay prisoners in order to ensure cheap products, Ruth Wilson Gilmore makes the point, and I think this is borne out by the evidence, that the primary goal of imprisoning those people, the primary force, is not profit motivation. Instead, it's this self-reinforcing system of public sector rent seeking on the part of a variety of different stakeholders. So the primary motivation for mass incarceration is managing surplus populations and managing these three other surpluses in addition to surplus labor, not re-enslavement of prisoners or re-enslavement of Black folks. Although, as we mentioned in the previous, importantly, as we mentioned in the previous lecture, one of the primary motivations for prisons is shoring up an anti-Black racial caste system. So it's not, prisons are not the same as slavery, but they do, and mass incarceration does shore up an anti-Black racial caste system. So that's an important distinction that's very, that'll play out in a lot of debates about prison abolition, Afro-pessimism, the capitalism critique, et cetera, throughout the season, I think. Additionally, one other point on the issue of population surpluses. Ruth Wilson Gilmore also makes the point that 70 million people, and this is also backed up by Michelle Alexander as well, have a record of arrest or conviction, which makes finding employment for those people hard. So not only does a prison system lock up a surplus population of workers, it also ensures this kind of self-perpetuating informal economy in which it's possible for a disposable workforce of workers who have the brand, the criminal brand on them, the felon brand, to be exploited by a variety of different market forces. So many of the people who can't find jobs because they're ex-cons end up working in the informal economy, working as gardeners, doing home health care, doing a whole host of different things, working as assistants for rich folks. There's a lot of different jobs that they take on, and many of those jobs have few or no labor protections, allowing those people to be hired and fired at will, and additionally depend upon a growing unequal economy in which a small percentage of extremely wealthy people are capable of hiring those informal workers to do things like function as housekeepers and maids, to do landscaping, etc., to serve as nannies, to perform a variety of sort of luxury labor roles for rich people. So increasingly, their role in the economy becomes yoked to the ongoing wealth of rich folks within the economy. So it increasingly becomes an economy in which day to day, many people, as many as 70 million people, are locked in an informal economy without labor protections, where they can easily be exploited and disposed of, and where their day-to-day employment and well-being and livelihood is often dependent upon the largesse of an upper crust of extremely rich folks within the economy. Okay, so now I want to transition to talking about rent-seeking and mass incarceration. This is a pretty important part of some of the underlying dynamics of the system. So as you can see, a neoliberalism in the free market ideology, while claiming to sort of roll back state power, while claiming to roll back the perverse incentives for stakeholders within the economy, they actually, in many ways, create and produce a situation in which stakeholders like prison guards unions and police unions accumulate an enormous amount of political power, and they become increasingly capable of organizing and ensuring that they get a huge percentage of state spending, that accumulates to them. And that's partly for ideological reasons, and that's partly for organizational reasons, like we talked about. So one of the things that often gets repeated is that, and you might have expected me to talk about this so far in this lecture, you might be thinking, why has Sean not talked about private prisons yet? Well, one of the reasons for that is that private prisons are not the central issue within the political economy of prisons and policing. 92% of those incarcerated are in prison, are in publicly run, publicly funded prisons, and 99% of those in jails are in publicly run jails. Additionally, private prisons are also targets of anger from law enforcement agencies and prison guards who want that money given to them for their own budgets, not given to privately run corporations who are not part of their various labor unions and who are not overseen by their administrations, who are not within their purview and their area of political power and authority. So a lot of the discourse about private prisons from within some of the research suggests that they're more parasitic upon mass incarceration than they are drivers of mass incarceration. They are corporations seeing a burgeoning area of public spending and attempting to siphon off some profit maximization possibility from that area of government spending, trying to get theirs out of that slice of pie. They're not the primary driver of mass incarceration. So all private prisons in the US could be closed, and it would still be possible, organizationally speaking, for not a single person to be let out of prison. So to say that private prisons and profit motivation are the central issue here misses the boat. Instead, like I said before, there's some of the fundamental drivers here are first, issues of political constituency, trying to win elections and trying to create support for cutting back the welfare state in order to ensure that those goods are distributed to a relatively wealthy share of the population. And building political legitimacy for that requires delegitimizing the welfare state. And the rhetorical techniques used to delegitimize the welfare state involved painting the welfare state as an area where an area of largesse where wealth was transferred from white folks to black folks. So the process for delegitimizing the welfare state, for shoring up the power of rich folks in the economy, for limiting the redistribution of income, for shoring up the political power of conservative constituencies, that requires at the same time using a set of justifications and a set of rhetoric that in turn makes prisons and policing seem necessary. So that's one of the justifications, is this sort of internal set of rhetorical and ideological factors. A second self-propelling set of justifications is competition for tax revenue and for a share of the government budget by state agencies. So state agencies compete with one another for revenue, and they attempt, as I said before, to maximize the share of the government budget, be that a state, local, or federal budget, that they get to spend in order to ensure that they can heap largesse on their own workers, to ensure their own position of authority and power within that particular department and administration. And neoliberal austerity creates conditions in which budgets shrink. And as a result, because of these ideological factors and because of some of the institutional factors, prisons take on a variety of social welfare functions, as we talked about before. So prisons, for example, because of these ideological and rhetorical dynamics, can get funding to provide mental health services in a way that other areas of society cannot. So people say, well, fine, I guess it's okay to approve these bills. Even Democrats will compromise on these things, or even Republicans who are skeptical about prisons and mass incarceration will compromise because they say, well, there aren't going to be any other funding mechanisms for mental health services if we don't do it within the prisons, because we're sure as heck not going to do it through publicly financed healthcare services. So it ends up being the case that prisons take on more funding. And after that funding gets allocated to prisons for mental health services, they increasingly take on that role. It becomes self-propelling. They gain that function. They develop state capacity to provide mental health services within the prison as they get that funding allocated continually over time. And in turn, other areas of capacity, things like social work, start to lose the ability to provide those resources to society. They lose their bargaining power. They lose their institutional authority. The people in charge of those agencies have to make increasingly difficult decisions about how to allocate their scarce resources. So over time, theorists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore make the point, and Michelle Alexander as well, make the point that this becomes a self-propelling system in which the prisons and policing have the ability to attract government funding and the legitimacy to justify taxpayer money in a way that other departments and other agencies do not, and that becomes relatively self-propelling. In addition, other agencies like education, housing, etc., can only get additional funding if they reframe their requests for funding as security requests. So for example, it's easier for public schools to get money to put metal detectors or school resource officers, police officers in those schools than it is for them to get money for additional textbooks, to get money for school counselors or nurses in the schools, to get money for free lunches or air filters as crime reduction strategies. So they can't use any of these other justifications. They have to use security requests as a justification because of the rhetorical and ideological environment created by neoliberalism and free market ideology as it spirals over time. Additionally, the result is an enormous dependency of the state on the Department of Corrections, police departments, and police and prison guard unions as organizing functions within the government. So police and prison guards unions, for example, wield enormous power over state and federal elections because they are very effective at being able to mobilize their constituencies and get them out to vote. So in turn, that makes politicians, elected officials, increasingly beholden to those unions. These unions are particularly powerful because they're hired by a single employer in a particular state, and they perform, or a single employer in a particular municipality, and they perform a function widely perceived by the public as essential, which makes it easy for them to organize in a lobby. So while a lot of public vitriol is heaped on teachers' unions because they're seen as a luxury political good, or they're seen as protecting bad teachers, prison guards and police officers are seen as being essential to the security and well-being of the population, so they are relatively insulated from public backlash. Many of the critiques of labor unions do not apply to prison guards and police unions for the reasons I've explained above about the internal contradictions within neoliberal ideology. So those unions are able to organize, and over time, their organizational capacity means that they're able to exercise tremendous political power, and in turn, that means that politicians are beholden to them, which in turn means that they're able to get a larger share of budgets, which in turn means they have greater degree of power and authority, and in turn, the government as a whole becomes increasingly dependent upon their growing capacity to carry out all sorts of different social welfare functions, like school, management of discipline within schools and mental health care service provision. this is borne out in the numbers. So from 1982 to 2000, the state of California built 23 new prisons and increased the prison population by 500%. And an article from 2019 described $15.5 billion of the proposed 2020 budget going to corrections. 40% of that $15.5 billion goes to staff salaries. So there's an enormous stakeholder interest in prisons and policing. They become functionally jobs programs. So this set of institutional sites of power, prisons and police as areas of institutional authority, of areas of enormous amounts of power to affect the day-to-day lives of people, to use lethal force, to lock people up and incarcerate them and move them away from the rest of society. Those institutions take on enormous power because they become functionally job and employment-based programs. So if you're a politician and you're against the money going to prisons and police, functionally what you're doing is you're hurting state employment. You're costing jobs. And it's easy for those labor unions to paint the idea of shutting down prisons or not funding police as anti-job action. So it creates this self-propelling set of justifications for continuing to fund police and prisons. In addition, as I mentioned before, rural white political constituencies have a huge investment in maintaining prisons. For the farmers who lease their land or sell their land to prisons, there's a big justification for building new prisons because they can get money where they otherwise may not be able to get it in what is a declining agricultural economy. And for rural white political constituencies, the prison coming to town means there is a new employer in town. So those municipal constituencies that are based upon the prison gain an enormous vested interest in maintaining prison and police budgets, especially prison budgets. In addition, those rural white constituencies and their elected officials have a political motivation, and there's a party motivation for maintaining prisons in those areas, because in many states, the prisoners in a particular prison count for the purposes of political representation as part of the population in a particular voting area, even though the prisoners themselves are usually not able to vote. So there's a sort of perverse incentive for politicians to keep very large prison populations in their home districts because it boosts the political power of their own party and it makes it harder to vote them out of office. It makes it easier for their party to gain an outsized or disproportionate voice in national and statewide congressional representation. So there's a lot of perverse structural institutional incentives here. As you can see, they're really not about the power of private prisons. They're really more about these really perverse rent-seeking interests within the political economies of prisons and policing. In part, this critique, this line of inquiry, analytic, helps to explain both why so many prisons were built and why prisons continue to be filled despite the fact that crime rates have fallen to all-time lows. So in combination with the previous lecture on slavery and mass incarceration, the issue is a combination of an anti-Black racial caste system, an anti-Black media and political environment, and a self-propelling political economic system in which the disproportionate mass incarceration of Black folks can be rationalized as a rational response to quote-unquote Black pathology, rather than as an issue of bargaining power, rent-seeking, and the institutional capture of politics by prisons and police unions and their various and sundry other interests. So it seems like all this incarceration is justified because of an anti-Black rhetorical environment. And in reality, that anti-Black rhetoric buttresses or covers up or papers over the real political economic interests that are at work. And oftentimes, to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's point, even rhetoric about private prisons can do that by making it seem like it's an issue of profit motivation, when in reality, the political dynamics are a lot more complicated. Part of the issue is also that various public sector employee associations and labor unions often support one another. So over time, as labor unions and their power have been rolled back, one of the most powerful organizing forces for labor unions, although that they are very fickle and not especially reliable allies, are police and prison guard unions. So labor unions feel like they have to make common cause with police and prison guard unions because they feel like those unions can buy them legitimacy, and because quite simply those unions have large numbers of people within them and they're very well organized. So there's a sense on the part of other public sector unions that their fate is intertwined, and as a result, they don't want to hurt those workers and the budgets or various bills that could be passed that could benefit them. In part, however, as I mentioned before, this understanding, this sense that these unions need to have solidarity with each other is based on a misunderstanding of the prevailing ideology of neoliberal austerity and the way it rationalizes public budgets. Those workers, to a certain extent, the teachers' unions and other unions, banding together with prison guard and police unions, are misunderstanding the prevailing ideological environments and missing that that rhetoric of neoliberal ideology uniquely allows prison and police unions to rationalize their particular government their particular government spending, their use of tax revenue in a way that those other areas of government in the public sector cannot. So importantly, and this will come up, a critique of Michelle Alexander's book is that less than 1 in 5 of those in prison nationally are in prison for violating nonviolent drug offenses. The reason I bring this up in this particular lecture is that while drug crime is not the primary reason people are in prison, the war on drugs and war on drugs rhetoric offered important rhetorical cover for mass incarceration. It was an impetus for mass incarceration, for expanding prison and policing budgets, for creating a series of media images in which it made sense to build SWAT teams and to give military equipment to police in the eyes of the overall public, and in which a variety of different Supreme Court decisions rolling back constitutional protections against search and seizure occurred. So those Supreme Court decisions that rolled back individuals' protections against police search also happened in the rhetorical environment of the war on drugs. So even though most people aren't in prison for nonviolent drug offenses, and even though drug crime is not the primary driver, and drug arrests are not the primary driver of mass incarceration, the war on drugs and the rhetorical environment it created, the set of incentives it produced, do offer an ideological explanation for why mass incarceration exploded in the way that it did. One of the other, in line with that, one of the really important things that happened in the rise of the war on drugs is that Pentagon technologies were given to police departments. And in part, this demonstrates another element of this sort of self-reinforcing system of public sector rent-seeking that's occurring. So I've said rent-seeking several times. First, before I go on and talk about Pentagon technologies, I want to define that term. Rent-seeking involves the extraction of value unrelated to contribution to production. So it's various forces finding ways to extract value for themselves, to extract money and capital for themselves without really contributing, by virtue solely of their bargaining power or their pre-existing wealth and political authority, not by virtue of the merit of their request or the merit of their demand for resources. So an especially pronounced example of rent-seeking involves non-competitive procurement, especially in military contracting and services in prisons. So, for example, the Pentagon and military contractors in particular can justify their own budgets in part by giving technology to various police departments and various in sundry SWAT teams across the country. So the rise of SWAT teams, Michelle Alexander argues, is in part a byproduct of the war on drugs. The Burn Assistance Program gave funding for specialized narcotics task forces and enforcement, and ensured that these militarized task forces were supported by federal grants. So there was an incentive for local police departments and city police departments to create drug-related task forces and SWAT teams because they could get extra money. In addition, a 1981 law passed by Ronald Reagan ensured that military technologies, created an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, and ensured that military technologies could be transferred for drug policing and drug arrests to local police departments. So there's this internally consistent set of interests at work here where the Pentagon can justify a really large budget for research and development by giving some of its technology to the military by spending up that budget every year with the knowledge that it can always get rid of any excess capacity it has, to police departments have an institutional rationale to create SWAT teams and specialized narcotics units because they can get additional funding from the federal government. Military industrial contractors like this arrangement because it ensures and it makes them happy because they have another supplier for their technologies beyond just the Pentagon itself. And even when the Pentagon is giving these technologies for free to local police departments, it's still buying the technologies from military industrial contractors. So there's this whole internally consistent set of interests at work that make it seem economically and politically rational for police departments to have these heavily militarized SWAT teams. And those political incentives are really self-reinforcing. Now, military industrial suppliers and the various and sundry interests involved in the Pentagon have an interest in supporting local police departments and their SWAT teams and the various legal arrangements that justify the transfer of military technology to local police departments. And in turn, police unions and prison wardens unions now have a vested investment in supporting military industrial contractors and additional Pentagon spending because it leads to a self-reinforcing system that will eventually benefit each of those constituencies as well. In addition, another form of rent seeking that's created legally by mass incarceration and by the war on drugs is civil asset forfeiture, in which police departments can keep a majority of the value of the assets they seize in various raids. And this existed prior to the war on drugs, but it really exploded with the war on drugs, including some reforms in 1984 that made it easier to engage in civil asset forfeiture. There was a reform in 2000 to civil asset forfeiture laws that increased the government's burden of proof to seize some of these assets, but it's still very low. So it's very difficult for the people who have their assets seized to stop the government from seizing assets. So what happens is there's a perverse incentive for police departments to conduct a bunch of searches, especially in poor and majority Black areas, to go looking for various kinds of materials that they can appropriate. Cars, in some cases houses, cash, guns, a variety of other resources. So they'll appropriate a ton of different kinds of resources. And once those assets are seized, they can go back into the police department. And the issue again here is not profit motivation, it's ensuring that your department has as big of a budget as possible that makes you seem essential, that you can present in the media as evidence when you're seizing cocaine or drugs or guns or whatever, to make it seem like your department's doing really important work to build political legitimacy and status within the community. And it produces a self-reinforcing system in which there is an incentive, because of civil asset forfeiture, to do searches that may not be justified. Again, in civil asset forfeiture, no crime has to be charged in order to seize assets. Nobody has to be guilty of doing anything. The standard that the government has to have in order to seize assets is very low. And because there's no right to attorney unless you're charged with a crime, many of the people who have their assets seized are not able to defend themselves in court. Those assets are just forfeit. They can't pay, or they don't have the money to go and defend themselves. They don't have the legal expertise to do it on their own and win against the government. So it's really easy for police departments to seize huge amounts of assets. So that's another way in which there's sort of this perverse incentive to do consent searches and to do a massive amount of stop and frisk, because civil asset forfeiture and the war on drugs allow for the police to massively expand their budget using that technique. And in turn, that creates a whole situation where there's a massive stake in stop and frisk style policing, or in very low constitutional standards for searches, because those searches on the part of police unions and on the part of those various stakeholders, because those searches allow them to seize assets, which in turn allow them to build their budget. So there's now a stake in a whole variety of different particular policing techniques that can allow police to carry out those searches. In addition to military industrial contractors, and in addition to civil asset forfeiture, an additional kind in the prison context of rent-seeking behavior that occurs outside of private prisons is the private provision of services within prisons, which occurs in public provisions as well. So this is the people that are providing food, medical services, telecommunications, etc., within the prison. One of the essential problems in markets is that if a market is not transparent, then it's very easy for particular corporations or agents within that market to exploit the other players in the market, especially the taxpayers and the prisoners. So in prisons, because prisons are outside of the view of the majority of the population, they don't know what's going on inside of them. They're located in rural areas away from the urban core where the majority of people live. The prisons themselves function as relatively opaque institutions. And the stakeholders operating within those prisons, including prison guards unions and the various private contractors that are contracted with the prison to provide these various kinds of services, tend to be very, very well organized. They have an enormous ability to mobilize very quickly because they're very hierarchically organized. And that makes it very difficult for grassroots movements and other political constituencies to oppose their power because they tend to be less well organized. They tend to have less of an obvious profit-motivated stake in the particular set of contracts that are signed within the prison. So it's very difficult to mobilize against them. So as a result, it's very easy for food, telecommunications, and healthcare service providers within the prison to charge the taxpayers and the prisoners ludicrously high rates. It's ridiculously expensive to make a phone call if you're a prisoner in a prison for no reason, simply then because the prisoners have no political power and the telecommunications companies providing the service have enormous political power. Food is extremely low quality, but the taxpayers are charged extremely high costs in order for that food to be provided. Healthcare services are often extremely poor quality, but the service provision is extremely profitable for the companies that provide it, despite the low quality of service provision. So rent seeking creates this huge gap in which companies can provide very low quality services and get extremely large profit margins out of doing so, not because they're providing a quality service or because they found some particular niche market in which they can compete effectively, but because they have enormous political power and that market is extremely opaque. It's not transparent at all. And the various stakeholders who could oppose them are not well enough organized to oppose them. So that creates a perverse incentive on the part of service providers within public prisons to ensure that prison populations are booming and to ensure that new prisons are built so that they get new contracts for their services. So again, that's another way in which there's this sort of perverse incentive within prisons for rent seeking that increases prison budgets and increases the political power of the pro-prison constituencies, which in turn rely on more people getting locked up. So they are in turn invested in police getting to use whatever techniques they'd like to lock up as many people as possible, and invested in a constitutional system that has as few protections for defendants as possible. Finally, I want to talk very briefly about the rise of the warrior cop mentality. And this is tied to some of these various and sundry political economic factors that we've discussed. So the fact that there's these SWAT teams, that police increasingly have all this military technology, creates a cultural sense that the police operate like military, that they serve a similar function. There's a lot of sociological evidence and social psychological evidence that says that in part, the particular tools and the particular uniform affects the particular way in which the people involved in an institution perform their day-to-day functions. So if you look, dress, and get the technology of a military unit, you're going to act more like a military unit because that's what everything around you day-to-day aesthetically in your comportment and in your training, that's how it teaches you to think. So simply by virtue of having all of this militarized equipment, the mentality and the culture of police departments changes. And that's something that Alex Vitale talks about in The End of Policing, and it's talked about in other sources as well, including in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. So there's a sense within departments of the warrior cop who is sort of heroically trying to protect an ungrateful public against a series of menacing threats that would otherwise inflict enormous harm and violence upon that public. I mean, it creates a department versus community dynamic, and that's reinforced in part by the police union's willingness to protect its own worst cops, its worst offenders. A lot of this has come out in the recent defund the police and Black Lives Matter protests, that a lot of police departments have protected their worst cops in part because of qualified immunity and in part because of the enormous bargaining power that police unions have, not just on their own terms, but their ability to get particular politicians elected and their ability to generate justifications for government spending. So there's this warrior cop mentality that happens as a result of devoting enormous amounts of time in training to using these military technologies, as a result of paramilitary units within the department, like SWAT teams that are intended to use that equipment to serve no-knock warrants, to break down doors, to gas protesters. So there's this real sense, simply as a byproduct of the material accumulation of equipment and resources and the organizational structure of the police union, that the police are pitted against society as a whole. And that's reinforced by the ideological message in police training that police are constantly at risk of being hurt, particularly by Black folks within the community. And that's particularly pronounced. Police shootings, there's some evidence to suggest, are particularly pronounced among white cops. So there's sort of self-reinforcing feedback loop that happens between these political economic factors within prisons and policing, the rent-seeking nature of the political economy, the racial caste system that neoliberal ideology and the free market ideology create a justification for, and the austerity discourse and the austerity conditions that are created by that free market ideology and that neoliberal ideology. So all of these systems create a self-reinforcing feedback system in which, a warrior, there's a bunch of different stakeholders with investment in a warrior cop mentality, with investment in the idea of really aggressive, violent policing, with a political economic investment in mass incarceration, at protecting police from being held responsible for shootings, at protecting prisons from being held legally responsible for bad conditions, at keeping prisons from being described and reported on by journalists, at ensuring that the Supreme Court upholds precedents that mitigate the ability of constitutional protections to protect people from prisons and policing. So all these things function as a self-reinforcing political economic system. Hopefully that lecture helps to explain some of the underlying political economic dynamics. I realize that this is sort of a complex lecture and that there's a lot of different moving parts here. This is one that might be worth revisiting later after camp or at various points throughout your season. And part of the reason why it's complicated to do a lecture like this and why some of the parts may seem a little bit confusing at first blush is because, like I've emphasized several times, the nature of the system is really self-reinforcing. And that means that it's really hard to isolate or take out any one unit, ideological discourse or participant, institution, and isolate it and say that it uniquely is the problem. The issue is the political economic regime game, that the rules of the game function in such a way that all of the particular participants have an investment in keeping things the way they are or in accelerating mass incarceration because it benefits them individually. And that makes it hard for any particular player to buck the system, because in doing so, oftentimes they are working contrary to their own immediate short-term interests. Or they are butting up against very well-organized, powerful, and rich interests that are willing to fight against them and that have the authority, money, and visibility to do so effectively. So in that sense, we can say that prisons and policing are, and you'll hear this term throughout the season, prisons and policing are part of a hegemonic neoliberal formation that reinforces anti-Blackness and racial caste at a day-to-day level. I know there's going to be a lot of questions about this lecture. I'm excited to talk to you about it more in lab Q&A. So hopefully that's helpful for everybody. Yeah, I'll see you all in lab Q&A.